state. It's a big job. So we're awfully glad to have her here, and I'm going to hand it off to her and help me welcome Donna Nelson.
Thank you, Chairman Keffer. Can y'all hear me? Yes? Okay. So I really am going to talk to you today about one of the biggest rules that the EPA has issued, but before I start talking about that, I wanted to put a little context around the rule and explain to you how our electricity markets in Texas work. So I'm going to get right down to it because time is limited. A lot of people, I think, are confused about where jurisdiction with various energy issues resides in Texas. And we have 3 agencies that address energy issues. One is the Public Utility Commission, the one that I work for. And we have economic regulatory authority over telecommunications, electricity, and water and wastewater. The Railroad Commission regulates oil, gas, and some mining. And the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality obviously regulates quality of water and air. So if you're thinking about this, think about in terms of a generation resource, so a generating plant, a natural gas plant. If the entity that owns it is regulated, then they come to us to get approval to build it in the first place and to include it in the rates. They go to TCEQ to get the environmental permitting, and if it uses coal, then there is a relationship to the Railroad Commission. So the PUC has quasi-judicial and quasi-legislative authority. I just like to say that because it sounds really important. What it means is quasi-judicial authority means we have contested cases, which are just like civil trials, except they're administrative cases. And then quasi-legislative means that we do rulemakings. We have all sorts of rules about who we can talk to and who we can't talk to in the context of both, but I'm not going to bore you with those details right now. So I'm going to skip over. I've got way too many slides, so I'm going to go through some of them quickly. Now, the way electricity markets started out many, many moons ago, way before any of you were born, and in fact before I was born, they started out with specific geographic areas, and there would be one company that owned the wires and poles. They would provide the generation resources, and they would have the relationship with end-use customers. They were a monopoly that was granted to them either by their locality or by the state. And over time, it became apparent that it was really important for from a reliability standpoint and a cost standpoint to enlarge those areas. And that's how the reliability organizations like Orcutt, Electric Reliability Council of Texas, and other regional transmission organizations were born. They took the air traffic control job that traditionally was done by transmission and distribution utilities. Now, the important takeaway in terms of the Clean Power Plan rule for you with respect to this is that Texas has an extremely complicated market structure. We have Orcutt, which you can see here in green, right? Can you see that? I don't see it up here. Well, it's the green one, right? The biggest part of Texas. That covers 90% of electric consumption in Texas is through Orcutt. It is located entirely within the state boundaries of Texas. Now, going back, let me just tell you, that was no accident. You know, we are an independent sort. We were an independent sort when the market was structured. We did not want to be interconnected with other states. Excuse me for a second. I have a cold, and unfortunately, the antihistamines I took to make me not sneeze throughout my presentation also sucked all the moisture from my mouth. So, but outside of Orcutt in Texas, Texas is in areas that we share with other states. So they cross boundaries of the state and go into other states. So let me just, this is a better map of the light green is Orcutt, and then the blue is SPP, and the pink is MISO, other regional transmission organizations. Outside Oops, I'm going to jump ahead and talk about our electric market in Orcutt. Even though all this is very interesting, there's no way I can cover it all. In Texas, we think we're better than everybody else, and in many cases we are. And with respect to our electric market, we really are. Our electric market is the envy of people in the United States and throughout the world. And why is that? Well, in 1999, like I told you earlier, electric markets have traditionally been regulated. So regulation, from an economic standpoint, is always a substitute for competition. So you only regulate a market to the extent that competition won't work in that market. So for instance, if it's a natural monopoly. So the legislature restructured the market, and they said to the companies that provided service, you need to unbundle your companies, your services into 3 discrete areas: generation, transmission, and distribution, and the retail provision of electricity. And so that is over a 3-year period. The PUC oversaw that unbundling. The transmission and distribution, because those are the poles and wires, are a natural monopoly, so that company continues to be regulated because generators need access to that infrastructure to be able to compete, and retail electric providers need to be able to have access to those resources to be able to provide service to end-use customers. So, all money invested in the generation market in Texas is invested at the risk of the company that's building the generation. When the markets were regulated, that investment was made at the risk of ratepayers. Now it's done at the risk of the company that's making the investment. And that's important, going ahead to the Clean Power Plan Act. It's going to be important, and I'll go back over that with you in just a bit. I'm going to forward a few slides. Okay, this is an interesting slide because it shows you the generation mix in Orcutt. So if you look at the chart on the left, that shows installed capacity, the actual generation that is on the ground. You see we have 55% of our market is served by natural gas, 24% by coal, 6% nuclear, and 14% wind. Now, I have to ask, you probably aren't surprised by that because you go to school here, so you see a lot of the wind turbines. Texas has more installed wind capacity than any other state in the United States. Texas has more installed wind capacity than California. The chart on the right shows you it's a historical look back over a year to tell you what energy we actually used, what energy was actually generated. So 36% of our energy last year was generated from coal, 41% natural gas, 11% nuclear, and 10.6% wind. This chart and the next one I'm going to show you, I think, are 2 of the most interesting charts in my presentation. This is a week's worth of generation over a 24-hour period. So it starts at 12 a.m. and ends at 12 a.m. So what you see is, this is in April, which we call shoulder months because we don't use a lot of electricity in the shoulder months. So the bottom, the very dark blue on the bottom is nuclear, the red is coal, the green is natural gas, and the teal color is wind. And you see what a very large percentage of electricity is being generated by wind. Except you see that day, that's Thursday, you see wind was down, and so what happened is you had natural gas filling in that gap. The other interesting thing about this chart is usually what we use to follow wind to make sure, so in the electric infrastructure, Orcutt has the unenviable job of matching supply and demand at every moment in time. If they fail to match supply and demand at every moment in time, the grid goes down. What does that mean? It means we have no power for days and maybe weeks at a time. So we don't have a lot of storage. That's a whole nother story. But so they have to maintain that. So when wind goes down unexpectedly, what happens is natural gas fills in. So you see that. Now look at a day in July. Same colors. Nuclear is still on the bottom. Coal is red. Green is natural gas. But look at how little wind there is. And most of the wind, you see that at the end of the day and during the middle of the night is when most of the wind is generated in the summer. Wind is a really variable resource. I don't know if you all lived here in 2011. I affectionately call it the summer from hell because we had 90 days of 100 plus temperatures. During that summer, we had wind in off-peak went from a low of 26 megawatts of generation to a high of 6,310. So it's an understatement to say it's a variable resource. So this is a really busy map, and I apologize for that. But in 2005, the legislature enacted a bill that required the commission to look at building of transmission lines to get electricity from where it's generated for renewable resources to the load centers of the state. Because, as you would expect, wind is mostly generated in the Plains area, West Texas, and the Panhandle, and the population base of the state of Texas is in, of course, more the eastern part, Dallas, Houston, Austin, San Antonio. So Texas invested $7 billion in building transmission lines, those sets of lines that you see up there. Every red line is a transmission line. It's 3,600 miles of transmission lines. That's predominantly what allows us to have so much renewable resources and to be the state that has more installed wind capacity than any other state. So let's just talk a little bit about what does that mean for customers? Okay, you're saying that our market structure is great, it's great to have competition, but what does that mean? Well, this is a website that we operate at the PUC, and it allows customers that live in competitive areas to shop. And what it means is that our rates, customers in the Orcutt area of Texas, in the competitive area of Orcutt, can get a 12-month fixed rate product that is lower priced than the last regulated rate in 2001. So our market has been extremely successful. All sorts of products are out there. Customers can get prepaid products if they want prepaid products. They can get products that give them points, like airlines do. They can get products that give a certain percentage of the profit to veterans organizations. The market's been very successful. Now, I'm going to talk about the EPA regulations in the context of the markets that I just talked about. What I'm really going to focus on is here's the rates. So if you look at this, you see the last regulated rate. Let's look at the Encore area, which is the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The last regulated rate was 9.7 cents a kilowatt, and you see there's a 12-month product. This was the 13th of January for 7.2 cents, so significantly below, 26% below just in flat rate, the last regulated rate, and 44% below if you adjusted it for inflation. Okay, let's talk about the Clean Power Plan rule. So in June of last year, the EPA published a rule that attempts to regulate carbon emissions under the Clean Air Act. So I'm going to go back a few years. If you recall, Congress attempted to pass something that would do this, maybe in 2010, and it failed. They tried on several different occasions to pass it, but it failed every time. So those of us in the industry were waiting for the EPA to publish something, and so in June of last year they published sorry. The last thing I want to do is cough into a microphone. In June of last year they published a rule. It has a really aggressive time frame. It will become effective, so it's published at this point. So what happens during a rulemaking process? A rule is published. This is the same for us too. So you say, this is the direction we think we're going to go as a federal government or a state government, and then you take comments. You read the comments, you synthesize them, and then you decide how you're going to change your rule. So on December 1st, comments were due. In August, the rule was published in June. In August, the PUC, TCEQ, and the Railroad Commission held a joint hearing to get comments from interested parties. And we used a lot of those comments to form the basis of the comments we filed with the EPA. So we filed comments on December 1st, and our TCEQ filed comments. We focused on what will this do to the provision of electricity, and our environmental agency really focused on how it works from an environmental perspective. So we filed comments in December, and now they've said the rule will be effective mid to late summer. After it's effective, the states have 1 year to file their proposal on how they're going to meet it, a state plan. And you can get a 1-year extension, but that's it. And then you have to start complying by 2020. So the time frame is so short. So what's going to happen based on the rule is that, and I'll get into this a little bit further as I go on, but within the Orcutt area, 8,700 megawatts of coal will be closed. That's what Orcutt's estimating. Well, it takes years to build power plants, and it takes even longer to build transmission lines. So for instance, if you have to rebuild transmission lines because your transmission lines go to your existing resources, it takes in Orcutt 5 to 7 years. So the possibility of complying on the time frame that EPA has set out is really impossible. Even more important than that, it really ignores the fundamental jurisdictional divide between states and the federal government. At the beginning, I pointed out to you that Orcutt resides entirely within state boundaries. What that means is the Public Utility Commission has authority over the wholesale market in Orcutt. No other state has authority over their wholesale market. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has authority. This rule gives the federal government authority over our market. What they did was generally, and I'm not an expert on EPA, but I'm an expert on electricity markets. And what they did is normally they regulate emissions in what's called inside the fence, and that means a specific power plant. So there's a power plant, and the EPA says your emissions can be no greater than this. Then it's up to the power plant owner to decide what it's going to do, whether it's going to put additional modifications to its plant so it can generate all the time, whether it'll just generate during certain times, but they have the decision. So this rule uses, for the first time ever, outside the fence. They said, and I've heard Gina McCarthy, who's the head of EPA, speak several times, and she says this was meant to give the states flexibility. The truth is, it has 4 building blocks. One of them is within EPA's bailiwick, meaning their traditional environmental jurisdiction, and that is make fossil fuel plants more efficient. I would argue that they've gone about it the wrong way, but that's the one area they have authority. The other 3 building blocks really are redispatch of power, build more renewable resources, and install more energy efficiency. I'm going to go over these a little bit more as we move forward. What's important is the state legislature and the governor determine what our renewable portfolio standard is. This would transfer that authority to the federal government. The state legislature and the governor determine what the energy efficiency standard is for Texas. This, again, would make a mandate by the federal government. So the other thing is, the rule has a disproportionate effect on Texas. One of the interesting things the EPA did was they gave every state a different requirement. So Texas has 11%. We generate 11% of the electricity used in the United States, and we're required to have 18% of the reductions under the rule. This is really the most interesting chart of all. This, as the rule is currently written, Texas would be required to have an 150% increase in installed renewable capacity. Now, one of the great ironies of the rule is, remember how I told you we've got more installed wind capacity than any other state? Well, the EPA says between 2005 and 2030, this will reduce carbon emissions by 30%. Okay, what's wrong with that analysis? What's wrong is they're going back in time and starting at 2005, even though the rule won't be effective until next year, or this year. So Texas had most of its installed capacity in wind installed already, but they're using 2012 as a baseline. So what that means is Texas doesn't get credit for the $7 billion that it invested in building transmission lines to get the renewable resources to the load centers, to the customers. And on top of that, they said, okay, you guys really know how to do this, so we're going to make you have 150% increase in your renewable resources. Now, what's really crazy about it, remember how I talked about matching supply and demand and how you have to do that to keep the grid up and running? With 150% increase in renewable resources, we will have more renewable resources on the grid than we have electric usage during the spring and fall. And you can't turn wind on and off very easily. So it's kind of crazy. Okay. Again, in that previous slide, we were I think I didn't tell you this very well, we were the state on the far left. In this slide, the state on the far left, and this is what our requirement is in a decrease in coal generation, 51.91%. You compare that, it's greater than the next 9 coal generating states combined, and it's greater than the requirements for 29 other states combined. Going back to I'm going to forestall a cough. Okay, going back to the 4 building blocks, if you remember, the second one is a redispatch of natural gas instead of coal. So one of the reasons the linchpins of our market is that it has economic dispatch. So what does that mean? It means that generators bid into the market in 5-minute increments, and Orcutt looks at what demand they have, and they buy generation based on the lowest bid. So it's a marginal base. It's based on their marginal cost, and so that ends up in being now keep in mind. But let's go back. We all care about the environment, right? But these plants that are being run have met all the environmental requirements. So it's not that we're saying we don't care about the environment, because we do care about the environment. But these plants have met all the environmental requirements. So the market itself just says, let's look at resources that are available and dispatch what is the least costly to customers. This rule would require a redispatch based on environmental factors. So what the EPA is trying to do really is a carbon tax. EPA, I think, recognizes it doesn't have the authority to do a carbon tax, so they're trying to get states to come up with the idea of a carbon tax just to make it workable. So in the areas MISO, which is that area in blue that I told you in East Texas, the Entergy area of Texas along the Gulf Coast, were in MISO. They anticipate retiring an additional 14,000 megawatts of coal generation. SPP, which is the area in West Texas and a little bit of Northeast Texas, they anticipate retiring almost 2,200 megawatts of generation by 2020, which is 39% of SWEPCO's total installed capacity, 100% of its baseload generation in Texas. If there's anything I want you to walk away with today, it is this. Let's set aside the policy discussion on whether the U.S. should pass something limiting carbon emissions. There are other areas. Australia, for example, passed a bill that would put limits on carbon emissions. But after its rates went up radically, its customers and citizens so rebelled that they ended up repealing it. But setting aside that issue, the question then becomes, is this the best way to do it? And I would say to you, it's not, because they are using their authority to abrogate the states' rights to control their own markets. So Orcutt anticipates that up to half of their existing coal capacity will be retired. There will be challenges to the reliable operation of the grid. Remember, when we talk about renewable capacity, the wind generators generate and the other natural gas resources ramp up and down based on whether wind is blowing or whether it's not blowing. The more renewable resources that you get on the system, the more issues you have with trying to maintain the integrity of the grid. The Brattle Group estimates that Orcutt and SPP energy prices will increase by at least 10 to 18 per megawatt by 2030. Based on everything I've read, I think 35 per megawatt is more realistic. So let's put that in context. The wholesale price right now is around 40 megawatts. So that almost doubles the cost of the energy part of the bill. And I finished ahead of time. So at this point, I will welcome any questions from y'all.
All right, well, we got lots of time for questions. Who's got one?
And if you don't, I can talk.
Mr.
Yes.
Dave?
Yeah, I've got two. Have y'all challenged the EPA's, or has the state challenged the EPA's role? And second, do you think that emerging energy storage technologies are going to represent a paradigm shift, or are they still too far away to really be?
Okay, really good questions. So at this point, since it's a proposed rule, we can't really challenge it in court. We filed comments. The EPA really, and this isn't just true in this rule, but they don't really, and they're not meant to. They don't have a very good understanding of how electric grids work. And so we really filed comments to say, hey, you kind of got this, other than just the challenges to their jurisdiction. We said, assuming you have the jurisdiction and everything, you've misinterpreted how these markets work. So we did file comments on December 1st. Once they finalize the rule this summer, then we can actually file an appeal. We can look at the rule, say, did you take into account our comments? And based on whether the rule ignores our comments, we'll make an evaluation as to whether we can sue. In terms of storage, but even if we sue, the companies that have to comply with it, unless we get a TRO, a temporary restraining order, the companies that have to comply with it will probably move forward to comply with it. In terms of storage is still relatively expensive. In 2008, when natural gas prices were really high, storage was really starting to gain some footing in the market. But because natural gas prices, when you look at the fact that we're trying to provide electricity to customers at the lowest possible cost, keeping in mind that all the plants have met their environmental requirements, because you can generate from natural gas for so much cheaper than you can use battery storage, those technologies have not really gained a really big foothold. There are some batteries, but they're very small. But they will continue to gain footing in the market, over time if the cost goes down. Yes, sir.
You had a graph up there that showed Texas and the next 9 or 7 leading coal-producing states. And we had something like a 50% reduction in coal-fired plants. I think that caught that West Virginia has a 0% mandate.
Yeah.
If that's true, it seems like this rule is a lot more politically inspired than actual environmental policy or anything like that.
Well, it does seem like Texas has a big target on its back. So, for instance, when they got the way they got our renewable mandate, the 150% increase, was they looked at a region of the United States, and they picked out Kansas, and this is really detailed. And Kansas has a statute that says they have to produce 20%, or 20% of their installed capacity has to be from renewable by a certain date. Okay. That is not 20% of the energy, because you have to have a lot more installed capacity to generate the energy. So it's a much larger number when you look at energy. So the EPA said you have to have 20% of your energy from renewable resources, but the Kansas statute has a provision that if it increases costs for consumers by more than a certain percentage, then the requirement goes away. Well, the EPA took the 20%, even though it was capacity in Kansas, they extrapolated it to energy, and then they ignored, the customer protection aspects of it. Yes, sorry.
How is wind going to be affected with Congress not renewing the tax rate?
Oh,
It doesn't seem economical at all.
Okay, this is the thing. I am not a fan of the production tax credit, because remember when I told you the wholesale market, people bid in? If the average wholesale price in Orcutt is $40 and the production tax credit gives them $23, you can see that it puts wind producers with an unfair advantage. The production tax credit was started in 1992. Taylor Swift was 3. Okay? I was young in 1992. So when you do an incentive to start out a new technology, it should be limited in duration and scope, and I don't think anyone thinks that. So they're going to continue it. Everybody believes they're going to continue it. So on the one hand, I hear people saying all the time the cost of wind has come down, but yet the wind generators still want to continue to receive the subsidy. So last time they renewed it, they said this is going to be the last time we renew it, and so what I'm hearing now is they're going to renew it as part of the big budget or whatever, as part of some big deal they make. And it will be the last time. But, we've heard that for the last few years. Oh, and by the way, the new technology in 1992 was caller ID.
It's always safer to make any reference to Taylor Swift whenever, explaining a point. But one thing that you sort of glossed over that I think might be helpful, because I don't know that this is a point that everybody fully appreciates who are wind advocates. Because wind is so fluctuating in its dependability, explain maybe in a little more detail what actually happens at the power plants and on the grid when you're depending on wind and wind's not there. What sort of has to kick in to pick up the slack?
Well, so when I showed you those charts back many, many moons ago. Okay, so if you look at this chart, Orcutt does forecasting a day ahead on what energy they're going to need, and they forecast what wind will be there. And so one of the services that we have in Orcutt, they're called ancillary services, and those are the services called regulation up and regulation down, where ERCOT pays whoever comes in and bids to be there, and they have to be able to be there in a very short period of time. ERCOT pays them to be there when wind unexpectedly goes down. So what happens is there has to be another resource. Now, the way it's distorting the market is it's dispatched all the time, and it always bids in lower. Why does it always bid in lower? Because it's getting a $23 per megawatt production tax credit from the federal government. So when other companies are bidding in at maybe 30 or 25, wind often bids in at 0. And so that wind is always dispatched because they get the production tax credit. Their marginal cost will always be lower. So they're always going to be dispatched if they're there until they're not there. And then when they're not there, ERCOT has backup power that they can dispatch.
Right, so to the extent that any of these rules start closing down coal plants or start making natural gas plants less economic for investors to want to build, things start shifting to wind. But when wind's not there, suddenly we've lost what would always be there to sort of pick up the slack.
You absolutely have to have fossil fuel generation to be able to back up wind. And the reason I made the point about the way we have so much wind right now that the generators in Texas largely, and remember, they're investing all this, the investments they make are at their own risk. So it's gotten to the point where they only really make money in the summer months because of the wind, because of this wind issue where wind is dispatched and they get backed off because wind is bidding in at a lower price because of production tax credit. So if you get more and more renewable resources on the grid, that exacerbates the problem. And even if they can stay open, stay up, if they meet all the requirements, a lot of them are just going to close down anyway because they don't get dispatched enough to cover their costs.
Right. I think a lot of times when people talk about renewables, they're thinking in terms of wind and solar. So we've talked about wind and how much wind capacity we've built in Texas and how much farther ahead than any other state, despite all these other limitations that wind presents. But what about solar? What role does solar play in the ERCOT grid? Well,
I have sometimes been accused of being a hater, of renewable. I'm not a hater, but I think the truth is, I think all resources have a place in the market. I think wind has a place in the market, but if you subsidize one resource, it's not a real market. It's like Animal Farm. All animals are equal, except pigs, who are more equal. So solar, we haven't had the distortion in solar that a lot of other markets have, and it's largely because of our competitive market. A lot of other areas, including Australia, in Queensland, which Eastern Australia has 5 states in its market, and Queensland has this crazy subsidy that's paid to solar resources, rooftop. So 25% of their homes in Australia have rooftop solar. And again, they're being paid way more than the resource is worth, because with solar too, if the sun doesn't shine, there are days in the summer when the sun doesn't shine. And there are days when solar resources look like an EKG. So solar is even less predictable than wind because it goes down much more rapidly when a cloud passes over. So what's happened in Australia, because they've got so much installed rooftop solar, that even though their retail rates are 3 to 4 times what ours are, their wholesale rates are about the same as ours, and many of the generators, natural gas generators, also are natural gas producers in Australia, and they're going to close their plants down and start shipping the LNG because it makes more economic sense for them to ship it and use it as LNG than it does for them to generate electricity with it. And in that situation, they're not going to have anything to back up to make those very quick ramps up that they have to make renewable resources work. The other problem it has is when I went there, they have an equivalent to Orcutt who manages their grid, and I went and met with them for a day, and they don't really have any knowledge of rooftop solar resources being installed. So remember how I told you Orcutt predicts on a day ahead what resources they're going to need? Well, they don't know how much, because they don't have visibility into that. You know, they can see, you go to Orcutt and do a tour, which I would suggest all of you do if you get to Austin, because, you know, if you go to Austin, really the fun thing to do is go to Orcutt. Forget the music, but Orcutt can see every generation resource. You know, they've got a control room and they can see every generation resource. But you know what they can't see? Those rooftop solar resources.
Okay. Anybody else? Mr. K, you got the...
Yeah, just one last question. You brought up Australia when they're bringing the export LNG terminals online. With the EPA's rule, assuming it goes into place, wouldn't that coincide with us ramping up our exports of LNG? How is that going to affect that charter?
Well, that's a really good question. We don't really, our generators generally don't own, you know, they buy natural gas. But you know, you are raising a really interesting issue, and I'll tell you a little story. So in the Northeast, they have their own regional transmission organization in the New England area. And I don't know if you remember, but during the polar vortex last year, they had natural gas prices go through the roof when they couldn't use them. Natural gas prices went up. Well, guess what that did? It made people have to pay more for their home heating, and it made them have to pay more for electricity because electricity is generated from natural gas, and especially when you close all the coal plants because of the Clean Power Plan. In fact, they would have had massive rolling outages last year if the coal plants that are going to be closed under the Clean Power Plan would have been closed at that point in time. But Pennsylvania produces a lot of natural gas, but New York doesn't produce any because they don't want to frack. All those states up there have very active environmental groups, and so they can't really build anything. They've been trying to build a pipeline from Pennsylvania up to New England, and they can't do it. Well, some of our enterprising Texas companies that own natural gas, even though they really anticipated LNG being sent to other countries, guess what they're doing? They're shipping it up to the New England so that they can meet their natural gas needs. So natural gas then goes from like a cost of $3 to a cost of $10.
All right. Any more? Well, help me thank Donna Nelson for being with us today. Those of you who are in oil and gas 2 class get to stay here and continue the conversation. The next